welcome. Thank you for joining us. Today we have Tiffany Button joining us today to talk to us about a new project that Palliative Care Victoria has just launched. Tiffany's been working with PCV for about 12 months. She has a background in ICU nursing, and she's now an aged care project officer. So welcome, Tiffany. Great to have you here.
Lovely to be here. Thanks, Rose.
We have some questions for Tiffany that we're going to ask her all about her project and have a little chat about it. And hopefully you guys will really get to grips with what's been put on offer for you. And you can contact me and Rose if you have any questions about it, and we can put you on to Tiffany if you'd like any packs to be sent over to you as well. So Tiffany, would you like to just have a little bit of a chat with us about what your role is at Palliative Care Victoria and how you came to work on the Dignified and Respectful Decisions project?
No worries. Thanks, Sam. Well, it is a bit of a curly journey that I don't think I would have predicted when I started my nursing career, for sure. Like I'm sure many of the nurses out there, I started in aged care and was a PCA before becoming an EN and then an RN. But once I got my license and my skates, I started moving into the critical care world and worked in a combination of ED and ICU for about 15 years, and was getting to the point in my career where I was wearing a few hats. So I found myself going to a number of emergency codes through the hospital or managing shifts and trying to argue with management about bed positions. And in between all that, I started seeing little shortfalls in the system. So particularly for our older Australians, who I held quite dear from my early days in aged care, noticed that we weren't doing them the full justice, having them in the hospitals all the time. And then this project actually got advertised on seek.com. So I applied, and basically I didn't have a background in palliative care, but I was very passionate about making sure that older Australians get the dignity and respect that they deserve when they're actually at those final years of their life. Understanding palliative care is not just that end of life care that we give people. It was very important for me to start sharing that message with the community, that people start talking about their health earlier and planning for their end of life journey a bit sooner, to stop them coming into those emergency departments at 4 a.m. or being that 3 a.m. met call that I have to attend on the ward to break that really bad news to families that unfortunately someone is just dying of old age.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely the best person placed for it then, Tiffany, because you were seeing the consequences of not having these conversations in real time from the other side.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's very sad to see someone not just before they're unwell, but just be lonely and isolated in those hospital wards, and realise that there are opportunities to have care delivered in your own home or in your aged care home, where you can be surrounded by staff and people that are familiar. And a lot of the time there's not an unrealistic, but maybe a very high level of expectation of what we can achieve through acute medicine in hospitals that isn't actually possible when you start taking into account people's underlying health conditions.
Yeah, I see. This is a really big issue, and a bit of a soapbox for me about reclaiming our health and our dying, and being a bit more in charge of what happens to us near the end, instead of handing over, sort of wholesale handing over all of our healthcare to, the doctor or the hospital, and then sort of being wrung out at the end of it and being spat out in worse shape than we should be most of the time, and then
Absolutely.
we end up just prolonging people's dying instead of prolonging life.
Well, this is it. Just because we can do everything doesn't mean we should. And sometimes, particularly in this day and age, there are so many weird, wonderful things coming into the medical discipline. Everything can be quite extensive, and some of it can be very traumatic and very uncomfortable. So it really is kind of weighing up all the factors. And I think that we definitely do our community a disservice by not really telling them the full extent of their health conditions. and
Yeah.
letting them understand exactly what the consequences of some of these interventions can be for the older person.
Yeah, and that's where I'm glad I really like the fact that you've used the word dignified and dignity, because that's almost the first thing that goes out the window when medical intervention starts to go into overdrive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, most certainly. And I think the other thing that you probably touched on there as well is that I think when we put our faith completely in the hands of medical practitioners, we're also hoping that they are going to know when to start having these conversations and when to bring up decisions and the sort of the pros and cons of all the decisions that are being made. But the reality is that actually a lot of healthcare professionals are waiting for the client or the family to bring this up. And so you end up at a bit of an impasse where nobody's really opening up the conversation, thinking that the other person's going to start it when they are ready for it, which can turn into a bit of a problem too.
Oh, absolutely. It's the nail on the head. I think even in the healthcare sector, as we get busier and we get more demands on our workload, there's not an intentional but handballing of, can you have the big conversation? Because it's a big conversation.
Yes.
And I think that sometimes we think that it's some other discipline's problem to start that conversation. We'll just pick up where they stop. I think one of the biggest drivers we had when developing this project was, if we're waiting for healthcare professionals to have the conversation, it may happen too late. So instead, we're changing the dynamic and we're actually encouraging families to start these conversations. But more importantly, we're giving them those prompts and those tools on how to start the conversation, which can be very beneficial, particularly when you're working with more junior staff, when maybe they don't know how to start that conversation. But one simple prompt from a family member can be, can you tell me a bit about Dad's dementia? Can you tell me what to expect as it progresses? Can you tell me what care he'll require in about 12 months' time versus now? And what will that look like? How can I prepare for this? I guarantee every health professional is fully loaded when they're given a direct question. They're probably not as prepared to start that conversation from scratch, and that can be for a variety of factors.
Most definitely. That sounds like a beautiful segue, I think, Tiffany. Let's hear a little bit more about these tools and the projects that you've been working on and what's available to residential aged care workers and people who look after the elderly in their homes and in residential aged care.
No worries. Well, I'll go into more depth in our information session. So if anyone is interested in more information, please reach out to us. And we're actually going through in a very focused way how services can use these tools. But just to give a more broad overview, the Dignified and Respectful Decisions Project was a website that we developed. It talks to all Victorians, and essentially it's designed for carers who are making decisions on behalf of another person. The reason that we are talking to these substitute decision makers and not necessarily acknowledging that supported decision making role is just because of the structure of the project and the finite scope that we had. But we definitely don't want to discourage, that this can be used in supported decision making, as well as surrogate decision making in context. The messages within our material are not designed to tell families what the answers are. We don't tell you what decision to make in terms of yes or no or right or wrong or do or don't. It's more a structure around how to think about some of these decisions. And we talk to families about different types of decisions they'll need to make over the time scale of someone starting residential care service right through to end of life care and following that linear journey. So we begin when we talk about being prepared in terms of identifying if there's any existing decision documents like an advanced care plan or a directive. If they don't exist, how you'd find that information, whether it's talking to GP services, extended family, or people in the community. We then go through what it looks like for someone living in residential aged care specifically in terms of who key staff are, and some of the more technical processes I think we in the industry take for granted, like what is a care plan and what are family meetings, and if you've never been exposed to them, what is the purpose of these things? The making decisions part of our project is probably the real nuts and bolts, where we start talking about different types of decisions that substitute decision makers will make. And these are things like, should someone go to hospital for various causes? Should they receive active treatment for a number of chronic health conditions as that condition progresses and deteriorates? We introduce a concept called goals of care, which some services may be familiar with already and may be familiar with it in more of the hospital setting. But essentially, this is looking at putting in place a current plan that if an emergency happened right here and now, what would that person's decision be in terms of active treatment? So whether they would want to be resuscitated, whether they would want to go to hospital for an emergency, or whether perhaps they're in the late stages of a disease and they're actually prioritizing comfort at this point, and they would rather have more conservative management in their own home. The last section of this site really talks about the bread and butter of palliative care, and this is what does it look like to receive palliative care in residential aged care.
Yeah.
We talk about that palliative care continuum and how it can start much earlier than anticipated, and initially it may be quite minimal in terms of treatment and care provided in that palliative care space, but then as that condition deteriorates and progresses, that need for palliative care will increase and that demand on curative intervention will diminish until you're actually just prioritising their immediate needs as part of their acute end-of-life care.
Yeah, I think that's a really great distinction to make. You often see a lack of understanding about palliative care, even from aged care staff, and that's like, when do they become palliative? It's not necessarily a moment in time. The whole idea of the palliative approach is the thing. That's the important thing to get across, that 99% of people in residential aged care are under a palliative approach, and so that's always a more gentle approach, time to stop and decide, is this at any point where there's some kind of intervention that might look like it's needed, what are we going to do and why are we doing it, and is this in line with the goals of care of the person? But to apply the sort of a blanket palliative approach to care is much more useful, I think, and then just sort of gets people into thinking, okay, so in general we're sort of non-interventionist, and because of all these things. Yeah,
it's interesting. As part of foundation work for this project, we actually met with a number of aged care professionals, from care coordinators to clinical educators to people in those link roles between services and hospitals, and that was actually a very common discussion piece, is that palliative care is something they would identify as quite late. But after further discussion, we actually realised that the reason a lot of them had that confusion was they've been practicing a palliative approach the whole time without necessarily acknowledging it. We know that as society is changing and populations are changing, people are entering aged care much older and much sicker than they were previously, because now we have more home care packages and capacity to stay in your own environment. And what that's meant for services is that your life expectancy once you enter aged care is obviously significantly shorter than in the community, just by nature. And the care that you would be given as an option will be limited based on those factors. And so we tend to have that palliative approach from day one without even realising it, just because of the sheer reality of medicine.
Yeah, but I think it's really important to make that distinction, and to always have that palliative lens. I think that gets missed a lot in aged care. It doesn't have that understanding, and so we're seeing unnecessary trips to hospital, or over intervention, and even just the idea of doing CPR on someone in a nursing home. It sounds a bit scandalous to sort of say, well, it should be an opt-in to say, because when I'm always talking about advanced care plan, which is another soapbox of mine, it is that people don't know what they're saying yes to, and the statistics are already dismal for CPR, and most of them are populated by younger people who just collapse or have a cardiac arrest for no real good reason. And so by the time the statistics, I actually should tease them out and get the statistics for 2%. Someone who's over 2% for over what age is it? Thank you, Tiffany. That's great.
It's if you have comorbidities or age-related frailty, the survival rate of CPR is less than 2%.
Yeah, which means it should never even be offered. That is just so low, such a low, like it's meaningless, really, isn't it?
I think the funny thing I've found from the years I've had these discussions, particularly about CPR, it's a different conversation saying, do you or do you not want CPR? It's more nuanced in, do you understand what CPR is and why you're doing it and what that will mean? And that's what we've really tried to flesh out in this site.
Yeah.
We do have a
that's
specific
great.
section about common medical treatment, and it goes into that more kind of black and white view of what common medical treatments you may be asked about in terms of your life-limiting illness.
Yeah.
When we talk about CPR, we acknowledge that, you know, what it physically is in terms of compressions and breaths, but then we also say it's given when your heart stops, and hearts don't just miraculously stop. There's an underlying problem. And if you have other heart problems or other disease states, then there could be a more insidious reason that your heart has stopped, which cannot be easily reversed. So although we can mechanically restart it through CPR, we may not be able to fix the underlying problem that can stop it happening again. Yeah. And at the same time, we may cause more complications and more distress to that person doing CPR for a futile cause.
Yeah. Talk about dignity.
Absolutely. There was an interesting story shared by someone from the Greek community. There was a son who loved his mother dearly, which I think no one would dispute. And when he was asked about the resuscitation status, he said, no, of course you give my mother CPR. You know, you have to preserve her life at all costs because she's the most special person. He then went to members of his community and was talking about these decisions. And one of his friends said, oh, I hope you didn't say that she could have CPR. It's barbaric, you know, what they have to do to a person when they give it. And, you know, it doesn't work very well in those situations. Well, he burst back into the facility within a week and said, I want my mother not for CPR. I do not want you to do that to her. And it was very much that understanding and preserving that dignity and recognizing what the intervention would entail. And that medical literacy, I think, gets lost in the system.
I think that's great too, that he got that information from someone in his community rather than being told by a health professional, well, you know, it probably won't work and this is what's happened. So now it feels like it's his decision he's made rather than being told that it wouldn't work.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's really powerful.
Yeah, stories are powerful too, though, aren't they? Like they're just so helpful to see the difference that it can make and what actually having these conversations can do, but can to benefit people's autonomy and choices and dignity. So that's great.
I think when a decision is just a decision, it doesn't go very far. If people don't have context, then they make poor decisions. And when we wrote this information, we actually really wanted to encourage those early conversations with healthcare professionals between families, in the sense that if you have a good story behind where your family member's health is at, if you know the sort of conditions they have and the journey that they're taking, when it gets to the point of making those big decisions about changing treatment and deterioration, you're more comfortable with them because you kind of have the backstory.
Yes, that's why I love the the Victorian Advanced Care Plan pro forma has the values directive section in there. And when I'm doing ACP with anybody, I always say, this is where you get to write your little manifesto, for want of a better word, and it stands in place of you when you can't speak for yourself. And so it basically stands up in the room and says, this is who I am, this is what's important to me. And then it gives context and something to apply to the current situation. And then it takes the decision making. It almost makes the decision for you, so that the decision maker they don't have to say, oh, I've made this decision, you know, on behalf of somebody else. You know, it's more about, well, I just followed whatever they said. You know, it made all the perfect sense in the world, and I couldn't have made any other decision if I'd tried, because this values directive was so clear that I didn't have to even think about it. I just followed what they wrote down, and everybody.
The relief that gives families, the weight off their shoulders, thinking I didn't do anything to hurt them. I did everything that I could to follow what I believe is in their best wishes or in their not their best wishes, that aligns with the wishes that they would have chosen for themselves.
Yeah, regardless of whether that,
Exactly.
yeah, regardless of the consequences. This is what they would have chosen. I just went,
Yes.
I just followed orders.
Yeah, it's the
Just do what I was
distinction,
told
isn't
again.
it? It's the absolute distinction. As soon as people realize it's what would they want, as opposed to what do I think is the best
Yeah.
thing that could like it's not about what I think, it's about what they would want, and that's when everything changes. And
Yeah, I've
yeah.
seen that. I've probably told this story a few times, but I saw that really clearly a few years ago in the middle of COVID, having to sort of redo everybody's goals of care form, and we had one resident who had pretty advanced dementia, but she was still, walking and talking and sort of interacting. And the two daughters came in, I was having this conversation. The older one started with, "Oh, well, no, we do everything," I could sort of see where she's coming from. The younger daughter looked at her and she said, "Oh, really?" So we talked a little bit. And then I said, "So what do you think your mother would want? Because this is what it's all about. What do you think your mother would want in this situation?" And immediately, like it was just instant, that the older daughter said, oh no, she wouldn't want any of this. And she went from everything to just, pull out and don't do anything. It was just that light bulb moment for her. And it was a light bulb moment for me to sort of see how in stark, relief, that all you needed to do was say, what do you think the person would want? Because that's what it all comes down to, isn't it?
Yeah.
Quite a complex emotional field too, because I find
Totally.
very rarely do you have these, super villain children who want to do something for the inheritance. It's usually coming from a place
Yeah.
of, it's normally, I love
Yeah.
my mum, and of course I want to see her live as long as possible because I couldn't imagine life without her. And I think that the difference is it gives them permission to do things that may end their life or it may shorten their life expectancy. But it gives them permission in the sense that it's a choice that they would have made themselves based on the situation they're in now. You are not responsible for nature's taking its
No.
course.
Yeah, and that's, we've sort of lost sight of that, really. We are all going to die, and she's got to die of something. You can't keep holding off death forever.
When you stop getting scared of death, you start thinking,
Yeah.
okay, well, how can I make it as good as possible?
Good
How can
and
I make it a
dignified.
pleasant
Yeah,
experience, for want of a better word?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Have you come across any other surprises, Tiffany, while you've been researching the project?
I think for me, the biggest surprise was really understanding that experience family members go through when they're supporting someone living in residential care or even in home care settings. I don't think I ever appreciated as a healthcare professional myself. It's a strange role to have, to go from being a home carer yourself with someone to then having supported care in a service and then feel like you're not a carer, but you are. There's almost like this community belief that once someone enters care, they're no longer the carer. It's like, no, leave it up to the doctors and nurses now. But yet you're still asked to complete the advanced care plan, all the documentation, the lunch menu, the 3 o'clock in the morning phone call about the fall. Like, you still have this hat without much acknowledgement. And I can imagine it's a very isolating and lonely role for many carers. And I was quite taken aback by how overwhelming it is for families. And I think for my own personal career, I've had frustrating conversations with family members who I thought just didn't understand. They're making terrible decisions. And now reflecting on it, it's, well, of course you're going to make a terrible decision if you're already overwhelmed and feeling isolated and perhaps there's conflict in the family and you don't understand all the information being given to you and the stakes are this high. Like, it really, you need to be in a well-equipped position, a well-supported space with the right people around to make well-considered decisions. And I think that that's something even beyond this project I'll take with me professionally.
Yeah. I think
Absolutely.
when we in doing the Pepper program, time and time again, it's either number one or number two that comes up. What's your biggest pain point around palliative care in your aged care facility? Families, families. They're constantly, the bane of my existence or whatever it is. But we always tease that out and realise that Yeah, the families are in a really tricky position. It's a really good point you make.
Yes.
That you're a carer, but you're not, and how involved do you get? And it's different for everybody. Some are just so relieved that they're finally no longer having to bear the burden of all that care. But yeah, they do still get the calls at 3 o'clock in the morning, and they're still required to input.
Help make those decisions. I think one of the biggest turning points there is just acknowledging that you are still, like, having someone acknowledge that you are still a carer even when your loved ones go into residential aged care. And I think that just helps so much with that sort of disenfranchised, like even the grief that you can feel when your loved ones end up having to move out of maybe a family home, and the loss that comes with it. And if you feel like you're also putting up hanging up the hat of being carer too, that we're not really acknowledging that these people deserve to have this grief and to feel these emotions that have changed, and yet still holding a chunk of responsibility, which, like, it's still taking a lot of emotional bandwidth up, and a lot of like needing to understand processes and have a bit of health literacy. So we're like, yeah, it's I think the turning point there is just acknowledging that carers are carers even when their loved ones are under the jurisdiction of residential aged care.
I think in this day and age too, where we are seeing, challenges within our workforce with us, we can't make enough nurses to save ourselves right now. So anything that makes the load easier for us, we want. And
Yes.
if you have a well-versed family who are supportive of someone, they can be the best asset in terms of support for a resident. I know from my experience in the hospitals through COVID, we really noticed when we stopped having families visit, I had to get so many damn cups of tea for people. I had to sit there and hold people's hand. I had to take them to the toilet 15 times, pass them cardigans. These are the small, fantastic things that I didn't realize families did. And much more than that, it's a family member for someone living in an aged care home could be the first ones to know mum's not walking right. Mum's not eating well. Mum's grimacing a bit when I touch her on her hip here. What seems like a demanding family is a conscientious carer in sheep's clothing. I think they can be a fantastic asset within a service if they've got that relationship. And within our resource, because we talk to families specifically, we really encourage them to start those conversations and build that trust with staff, to feel comfortable having these kind of conversations and concerns raised, and be that active member in the team without having to provide the physical care that they previously may have done.
Yeah, they still have these valuable things to input, and they're still just absolutely an essential component of the care of their relative, but it looks different.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's amazing. No, I like that. That's a great thing to learn. The beautiful things that you'll have been picking up over all this time, that exactly like you say, will just take you even after into the next job that you take on. It's just going to absolutely inform that, which is invaluable, really, which is amazing. Well, do you have any take-home messages for our aged care workforce that you think you'd like to impart? I guess that if there was one thing that you would like them to take away from this conversation, don't you love a question like that?
I was going to say, I've got three. Yeah.
You may have three.
Okay, if I had a magic lamp, I would want everyone to use good tools. So whether it's resources like the Dignified Respectful Decisions project, where you can talk with families through these tools, whether it's your PACOP suite, whether it's your LDOC model of care, whatever comes into the market in the years to come, have well-informed, validated tools, because it will help you in your communication amongst yourselves. It will help you in communication with your families, and it will make sure that you're practicing the best quality practice. These tools are not there for another piece of paper to make the government happy. They're there to actually drive care to be well delivered. And I think that we need to change the way we think around some of these checklists that keep coming through and really focus on the ones that are handy. My next piece of advice would be work with each other. One of the challenges I've certainly felt as an RN within aged care in previous roles was it's an overwhelming feeling having 150 residents to one RN or two RNs. But you are not alone, and you need to really put on that leadership hat and work with your team to get the best out of that care. So whether it's, huddling with your PCAs, your ENs, finding a way to communicate with each other about patients or residents who maybe aren't faring so well, come up with your own systems, be a leader and work with your team so that you really have a good picture of what's going on in your service. You are not going to be able to put eyes on every single person in a thorough way as you would in other settings. And my last one would be kind to yourselves and others. I think particularly with the challenges we've had the last few years, it's very easy to kind of put that stiff upper lip and, martyr sister complex, and I'm just going to kind of burn out and take on the load and do all the overtime and complete all the care plans that are outstanding. I think that especially when we're having traumatic events occur in our services, whether it's the death of a resident or a patient, or it could just be a very critical incident that was quite, like distressing for staff. Debriefing with one another, taking that time out to acknowledge it and give it that space, and looking at your own responses. And when you move forward, how is that going to change your practice or the way that you view on things? And, have you checked in with your other staff around to make sure that they're moving through this in a kind way as well?
Yeah, right. Yeah, teamwork is so important, more important than ever. I always say palliative care is a team sport, and you can't you can't deliver it on your own. Well,
No.
You need each other. Yeah.
I think if we're acknowledging that a human being is a complex series of lots of different components, then we're also needing to acknowledge that it's going to take more than one person to just really come in and holistically and in a client-centered way deliver the best care in that dignified way that we've been talking about today, and not shouldering the burden of that. Like sometimes healthcare professionals, we do tend to do and being able to work together, like you say, as a team. So I'm completely on board with your 3. I'm pleased you chose 3.
I think also the handiest tip I could give every younger staff member is make friends with the cleaner of your service. Guaranteed they know more about what's going on than anyone else in that building. They're the ones that have the opportunity to talk with the residents. They know what's going on with the staff, and they've got eyes everywhere.
Most definitely. Do not underestimate your domestic services, your front of staff, your front of house staff, your maintenance guys, catering. Holy moly.
Every spouse that walks out a little bit teary, that receptionist will see. So I think that it's a very much a collaborative effort to provide care.
Most definitely. I think that's beautiful. I think that sounds like the perfect thing to end on. So we want to really thank Tiffany for coming and spending some time chatting with us today. If you want to learn more about the tools and actually take a look at what it is we're talking about, there's a webinar that we're going to be hosting today with Tiffany, and we'll be recording it, so you can have a little look at that recording if you didn't come and see us live, and also just get in touch with us if you'd like to talk more about it.
And we'll put the website in the show notes for this video. The
show notes.
I'll become a podcaster if it kills me.
Well, thank you so much,
Thank
Tiffany.
you, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening, everyone.